So picture Europe in 1492. The idea that the Earth might actually be round is only just catching on, and then Columbus trips over 2 entire continents. Everyone back home pictured empty land waiting to be claimed. It wasn't. People had been living there for thousands of years, ever since their ancestors wandered over from Asia on an Ice Age land bridge. But Europe didn't see neighbors. Europe saw real estate. And they came running. England plants its first colony at Jamestown in 1607. Then, in 1620, a very different crowd turns up: the Pilgrims. Religious refugees shoved out of England who'd tried the Netherlands, hated it, and finally bet everything on a leaky little ship called the Mayflower, chasing freedom. After that, people show up for every reason imaginable. Georgia gets founded partly as a do-over for English debtors. Owe money you can't pay? Get on a boat, start fresh. And, far too easily skipped over, enslaved Africans, dragged across the ocean in chains. The people who were already there got the worst of it by a mile. Between disease and slaughter, something like 90% of the native population died. 90%. Whole nations gone, most of them before the colonists ever laid eyes on them. By now, England has 13 colonies strung down the Atlantic coast, which, as it happens, is exactly where the 13 stripes on the flag come from. Meanwhile, every power in Europe is elbowing each other for a piece of the New World. And the 2 biggest rivals, Britain and France, finally come to blows. It balloons into the 7 Years' War, a thing so enormous, fought across so many continents, that some historians call it the real First World War. Britain wins, cleanly. It walks off with most of France's North American territory and its first proper taste of being the British Empire. Fantastic news for Britain. Catastrophic news for Britain's bank account, because wars cost a fortune, and this one left the crown buried in debt. So Britain goes looking for someone to hand the bill to, and its eyes land on the colonies. The logic was simple enough. We just spent a fortune partly defending you, so you can chip in some taxes. The colonists' logic was equally simple. We're British too, so why are we getting taxed in ways actual Brits back in England aren't? And the resentment builds, and builds, until it boils over in Boston. A group of colonists, some of them dressed up as Native Americans, sneak aboard British ships in the harbor one night and dump every last crate of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party. And Britain's response was not, "Let's sit down and talk." Britain's response was to send the army, which, if your goal is to calm down a bunch of people who already feel pushed around, is a bold choice. It does the exact opposite. In 1775, the colonies and the British Empire go to war. France, still bitter about losing the last round, gleefully bankrolls the rebels. And for 8 long years, a ragtag colonial army under George Washington somehow wears down the most powerful military on the planet and wins. The colonies are now a country, the United States of America. Washington becomes the first president, and this brand new nation takes its first wobbly steps. Here's the thing nobody really tells you about that baby country, though. It was broke, it was militarily weak, and Europe did not take it seriously for a second. And then it lands the deal of the millennium, almost by accident. All America actually wanted was New Orleans, one port city so its goods could reach the sea. It sent men to Paris with orders to buy that single city, nothing more. But Napoleon had just watched his dream of a new world empire die in Haiti, where an enslaved population rose up and wiped out the French army he'd sent to crush them. Overnight, his enormous Louisiana territory was useless to him. So he made the Americans a counteroffer they never saw coming. Forget the city. Take all of it. The whole thing. $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, for a slab of land that doubled the size of the entire country in one signature. America went shopping for a single port and walked out owning a third of a continent. But doubling your land doesn't make you tough. Britain's still out there bullying, snatching American ships and sailors off the open sea, quietly arming native nations against the US. To this scrappy young country, Britain felt less like a rival and more like a pirate that simply would not leave. So in 1812, fed up, America declares war on Britain. Again. And this one gets ugly. British troops march straight into Washington, and the scene is almost insulting. They sit down and eat the dinner still laid out in the White House, and then they set the whole place on fire. The Capitol, the President's house, all of it, burning. And yet, after a few years of bloody back and forth, the war ends in a draw, which, weirdly, counts as a win, because trading blows with the British Empire and not losing was enough to make the rest of Europe go, okay, maybe we should stop underestimating these people. A few years later, President Monroe basically tells Europe, stay out of our half of the world, and we'll stay out of yours. And with Europe waved off, America stops staring east across the ocean and starts looking west, into the rest of the continent. The frontier era is open for business. And honestly, if you think the politics is the interesting part, stick with me, because America's about to start collecting states like a kid collecting marbles, and one of them is sitting on a literal mountain of gold. But first, the part of the story that turns dark fast. President Andrew Jackson, who flatly believed white people stood above everyone else, signs the Indian Removal Act, the very same government that, in its early days, had solemnly sworn to treat native nations with the utmost good faith and never take their land without consent, now forced tens of thousands of them off it at gunpoint. They were marched roughly 1,000 kilometers west, and thousands died along the way, of cold, of hunger, of sheer exhaustion. They called it the Trail of Tears. And when one leader, Black Hawk, was hauled in front of the very men who'd crushed his people, he refused to bow his head. "I am a man," he said. "You are another." The brawl over Jackson, for what it's worth, is what eventually split American politics into the two parties still slugging it out today. But that's a different story. By the mid-1800s, Americans are pouring across the border into Texas, which at the time belonged to Mexico, chasing land and business. So many of them move in that Texas basically fills up with Americans. Friction with Mexico keeps growing, and in 1836, the settlers just declare their own country, the Republic of Texas. America's cheering quietly from the sidelines. The catch is that the men who founded Texas were mostly businessmen, and it turns out running a country is a lot harder than running a business. So Texas starts leaning on the US, and Mexico is in no mood to sit and watch its own territory get swallowed. Mexico strikes first, and in 1846, the Mexican-American War kicks off. The Mexicans fight ferociously. Soldiers, civilians, everyone throws themselves in. But America keeps coming, and America wins. And the payoff is staggering. Texas becomes a U.S. state, and in the deal that follows, Mexico hands over California, Nevada, Arizona, and more. For a price, technically, but the kind of deal you sign with a gun on the table. For Mexico, it's a national wound that still aches to this day. For America, it's Christmas morning. Because look at what was sitting in that ground. Under Texas, oceans of oil. That's where West Texas crude comes from. In Arizona, the Grand Canyon. And in California, gold. In 1848, somebody finds gold in California, and the entire country loses its mind. People drop everything and stampede west to dig. The 49ers, named for 1849. California's population multiplies by 6 in a single year. They called it the Gold Rush, and it sucked bodies in from every direction. The country that had 3.9 million people at independence in 1790 had swollen to over 20 million by 1850. But under all that breakneck growth ran a crack straight down the middle of the country, and it was about to split the whole thing in half. Slavery. By now, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in America. In the South, the entire economy ran on them. Vast plantations worked by human beings who were bought, sold, beaten, and treated as property. Owning them was even a status symbol. The North had gone the other way, into factories and cities, and had started turning against slavery altogether. So here was one country built on two things that couldn't both survive. Sooner or later, one of them had to go. So a country half built on slavery and half against it walks into an election, and the anti-slavery North's man, Abraham Lincoln, wins it. The South does not take that well. In 1861, Southern forces opened fire on a federal fort, and the Civil War begins. Americans killing Americans by the hundreds of thousands. Early on, the South actually has the upper hand, but slowly, the North's sheer industrial muscle grinds forward, and the tide turns. In the thick of it, on January 1, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the enslaved in the rebel states free. On the ground, in the moment, it didn't change much overnight, but it changed what the entire war was about. 4 more years of carnage, and in 1865, the North wins. And then, just 5 days after the fighting effectively ends, Lincoln is shot dead. The killer? John Wilkes Booth, a genuine celebrity, one of the most famous actors in the whole country, and a furious supporter of the South. The story goes that Lincoln had once invited Booth to a celebration, and Booth sneered that he'd rather dine with a pig. That's how deep the hate ran. To this day, you can stand in Ford's Theater, where it happened, and see the very pistol he used. The war freed 4 million people, but freedom didn't come with money, or land, or a job waiting. So a lot of formerly enslaved people ended up working the same fields, for the same families, just under a new name. And the discrimination didn't stop. It dug itself in for another 100 years. Now here's one of my favorite chapters, because it's so dumb it loops all the way back around to genius. In 1867, Russia broke after losing the Crimean War and stuck with a gigantic frozen territory it couldn't possibly defend, way out past British Canada and miles from home. Decides to offload Alaska before Britain can just grab it for free. So it sells the whole thing to the United States. The price? $7.2 million. That comes out to about 2 cents an acre. People mocked it at the time, paying real money for a useless icebox. And then, Alaska turned out to be stuffed with gold, oil, and coal, and perfectly positioned to keep one eye on Russia forever. Within 50 years, it was worth 100 times what America paid. Today, more than 1,000 times. Best real estate deal in American history, no contest. By now, America has the taste for it. The whole world is out grabbing colonies, so America joins in too. In 1898, it annexes Hawaii, right in the middle of the Pacific, which quietly turns the country into a fortress you can't even reach without first crossing an ocean. Hawaii will eventually become the 50th state, and there's your 50 stars to go with the 13 stripes. That same swagger drags America into a war with Spain, and the way it starts tells you everything about the new America. An American battleship, the Maine, blows up in a Cuban harbor, killing hundreds. Later investigations point to an accident, most likely a fire in the ship's own coal store. But that didn't matter, because the newspapers had already decided. Hearst and Pulitzer ran screaming headlines pinning it on Spain, whipped the public into a fury, "Remember the Maine," and basically manufactured a war out of thin air. Hearst, the story goes, told an artist he'd sent to Cuba, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." America wins it easily and walks off with Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The old empire that opened the whole age of exploration stumbles. The new one strolls right in. The torch just quietly changed hands. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan is rising fast and eyeing Korea. But it's nervous the big powers will object. Funny thing, America is busy colonizing the Philippines and would also really prefer nobody object to that. So in 1905, an American official and a Japanese official meet quietly and basically agree. You don't question my Philippines, I won't question your Korea. No treaty, no signatures. Just a private memo, both sides buried so deep the world didn't even find out about it until 1924. And it greased the wheels for Japan to swallow Korea whole.
9 years later, in 1914, Europe's empires finally crash head-on, and the First World War erupts. America's instinct is the same as always. Stay out of it. Let them fight. We'll sell to all of them and get rich. And it works, for a while. Then, Germany does two things that drag America in anyway. 1. Unrestricted submarine warfare, torpedoing any ship it even suspects, which means American ships going down and Americans drowning. 2. A secret telegram to Mexico, offering to help Mexico take back Texas and the Southwest if it'll turn on the US. When that telegram leaks, America is done being neutral. It jumps in, tips the whole balance, and the Allies win.
After the war, America is booming. Its factories are pumping out goods cheaper than anyone alive. So cheap, and in such quantities, that eventually there aren't enough buyers to go around. Prices crater, unsold goods pile up, and owners start cutting workers loose. So underneath all that shiny prosperity, the floor is quietly rotting out. Until 1929, when the New York stock market drops off a cliff and drags the whole economy down with it. The Great Depression. In the cities, 1 in 3 people lost their jobs. And it didn't stay American. It tore across the entire globe. A new president, Franklin Roosevelt, comes in swinging. The government is going to jump into the economy and drag it back to life. That's the New Deal. The big empires, Britain and France, just retreat behind their colonies and ride the storm out. But the have-not countries, Germany, Italy, Japan, have no empire to hide behind. So they reach for the other option. Take what you need by force. That's the soil fascism grows in. If it's good for the nation, anything goes, violence included. And in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the Second World War begins. America, true to form, declares, "Not our fight," staying neutral. But as Britain starts buckling, Churchill keeps begging Roosevelt for weapons, warning him that if Britain falls, America will be staring down a Europe united under the Nazis, far stronger and far better armed than before. So Roosevelt threads the needle with Lend-Lease. We'll hand any nation that matters to our own defense the tanks, the planes, the ships, and settle the bill later. And to choke off Japan's expansion in Asia, the US leads an embargo cutting off Japan's strategic supplies. Japan was getting 80% of its oil from America. Cut that off, and Japan is cornered. So Japan gambles and hits America first. Enormous mistake. A furious America hurls its full, monstrous industrial might into the war, crushes both Japan and Germany, and in 1945, it wins. But winning the war just exposed the next problem, the Soviet Union, and communism spreading fast. So President Truman draws a hard line. America will back any nation resisting a communist takeover, with money and with guns. It pours aid into rebuilding Western Europe in particular. And just like that, the country that spent its entire life trying to stay out of everyone else's business gives up isolationism for good. The standoff with the Soviets gets unbearably tight. In 1962, the Soviets are caught building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, 90 miles off Florida, right under America's chin. For 13 days, the two superpowers stand with their fingers on the trigger, while the entire planet waits to find out whether this is the week the world ends. It isn't. Barely. The missiles come out. The deal gets struck. And only years later did people learn how many times, during those 13 days, a single panicked decision came within a breath of setting the whole thing off anyway. What it proved was simple. The only country on Earth that could stare down the Soviet Union was the United States. Then comes Vietnam. In the mid-60s, America, now with overwhelming firepower, wades in, dropping napalm and spraying Agent Orange. But the longer it grinds on, the more civilians die. And back home, people start marching against the war by the millions. Eventually, America pulls out. Burned badly, it announces a new rule. From now on, Asia is going to have to handle its own defense. The Nixon Doctrine. Worn down by a decade of this, both sides start hunting for an exit. Nixon does the once unthinkable, flies to communist China, then to Moscow, shaking hands with the enemy and quietly winding the tension down. The rivalry doesn't vanish, but the temperature finally drops. And then, in 1991, the impossible happens. The Soviet Union, the great rival, the leader of the entire communist world, simply collapses. The Cold War is over. And when the dust settles, the broke little colony that Europe couldn't be bothered to take seriously is the only superpower left standing. Its hands on the world's politics, its economy, its culture. And it hasn't really loosened that grip since.